right, folks, welcome to Nostalgia Trap. David Parsons here. I hope you're ready for a long, hot Nostalgia Trap summer, because that's what we're gearing up for. Seems like every summer Nostalgia Trap goes a little crazy, and I think that's partly because we talk about global events here, and there's always a kind of demonic energy to this summer. I really don't know what to expect from the summer of 2022, but I'm sure it will be some sort of unpredictable nightmare, and we'll be here for you. So if you want to join our little community, we can talk about it. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap is where you can do that. We have a lot of stuff on there. Bonus episodes, a regular column written by Justin Rogers Cooper in which he reflects on and expands on a lot of the ideas from all of our episodes. And we've got a few little side podcasts starting this summer. One called Gender Trap with Yasmin Nair, and one called Campus Trap with Ryan Boyd, in which we're trying to unpack specific elements of these nightmares. So come join us, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I'll stop bugging you about it, I swear, but it helps keep the whole operation going because we are truly an indie media network, which is another way of saying just a couple of people that are putting out a podcast. So if you can help us out and support our work if you like it, we appreciate that. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. My guest today is Carrie Conners. She is a writer and poet and professor of English at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens. And more than any of that, a good friend for many years who I have been dying to talk with on this program. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. We talk about a lot of stuff in here, including Carrie's poetry, but most of the focus of this conversation is her latest book, which is called Laugh Lines: Humor, Genre, and Political Critique in Late 20th Century American Poetry. We're talking about comedy. We're talking about humor. We're talking about the type of language that makes us laugh and why that matters and why it has power. It's certainly something that links up with conversations that are happening right now around, Dave Chappelle and Will Smith and Chris Rock and you name it. There is a power to humor, and what Carrie uncovers and thinks about in this book is what that really means and how that functions. And she uses the work of 20th century poets that you may or may not have heard of to kind of think that through. I just found this to be a really fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Here is me and Carrie Conners. All right, Carrie Conners, this has been a long time coming. I feel like I've been begging you to come on Nostalgia Trap for years, but thanks. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, David.
We were just saying before we start recording, you're one of those people that has two books published at the same time, one of poetry and one that's more of a book of analysis and theory and ideas about the history of poetry. So I just want to say the names of them really quickly because we haven't had a lot of real poets on the show, Carrie, and so I feel very blessed to be talking with you. But let me say the names of your book. You have two books of poetry. One is called Luscious Struggle. The other is called Species of Least Concern. Wonderful names of those poetry books. And then your latest book that I really wanted to talk with you about, because I think it links up to everything we do on Nostalgia Trap, this book called Laugh Lines: Humor, Genre, and Political Critique in Late 20th Century American Poetry. I guess we can start with like an NPR question. What is it that made you want to talk about and write about humor in poetry? Because I don't think when people hear the word poetry, they don't necessarily put humor next to it, right?
Yeah, I kind of think in some ways I was a bad student. I loved poetry like forever, but maybe a bad poetry student. I felt that way because I was always laughing when we would talk about poems in classes, and like nobody else is laughing, but I always found the humor in poetry, and especially in contemporary American poetry. I thought that there was so much humor, and I was drawn to it because of that. And I heard a lot of people, especially like in college, and then when I went to graduate school, speak about humor in fiction, and especially like postmodern fiction. And I just didn't hear a lot of people talking about poetry in that same way.
Right.
And there's been in the last just few years, a few more critics kind of coming out and talking about the relationship between humor and poetry, but still not that much. It's still very small. It's like burgeoning field. And so it was just something that I always thought was there, but that others weren't really talking about that much.
Right. I mean, part of the thing that you're doing is talking about a specific period in time, right? Like this post 1945 post-war period. Why that period? Because it seems like we talk about the 50s and 60s a lot on this show, and humor being like a political weapon, right?
For sure.
Mad Magazine is just one example. I mean, the whole counterculture of the 60s had so much of that. But poetry, I think people have an image of poetry still, which we can get to why that is, but like that's very self-serious.
Yes.
The
Staid.
poet, right?
Like, and there's this reverence for it, I think, for the genre of poetry that doesn't exist when you're talking about prose. But I just think that there's a lot of connections. And talking about that time period between poetry and sort of other art forms that used humor, including stand-up. And I find like there are a lot of connections there. And, the 50s to the 60s, and then sort of exploding from the 70s onward with stand-up, there were so many astute political critics that, I think everybody thinks of the Carlin, and prior, but there's just so many kind of Abby Hoffman, so many figures that used humor in ways that were politically incisive. And I see so many poets of the time period doing similar things. Some poets that come to mind, I think immediately for a lot of people, maybe from the earlier part of that time period, or like Allen Ginsberg, right? There's a lot of humor in his work, and very, very political, a lot of the beats, but I think Ginsberg is a very good example, right, of a poet who uses sort of the rhythms of humor in his work, and some of the same strategies, I think, that sometimes some stand-up comics use in their work as well. And so
what do you mean by that? Because I love that idea of like the strategy. Because I mean, reading just your book, just reading the introduction where you're sort of laying out like what the idea behind this book is. You're sort of saying that like there's a punchline to humorous poetry, and not only humorous poetry, but poetry seems to have a similar. That I found that very compelling. That idea, Well,
also, if we think even of a sonnet, right? Some sonnets, not all sonnets, but some sonnets have like that turn at the end, the volta, right? Which acts in a way as sort of this snappy conclusion or a turn, right? And that functions in a way that a punchline like functions. But then kind of thinking about some of the strategies that Ginsberg would use as far in his work that's really funny. It's sort of listing like more, and lots and lots of lists of things and kind of catalogs, and that create opportunities for humorous juxtapositions. And Carlin was a master of lists in his work, list upon list upon list, and like rapid fire. And it's
kind of amazing that he memorized those lists. Watching the Carlin shows is almost disturbing by like those. And it's clear that like, you're right. To me, like, I mean, with Carlin, the line to beat poetry is pretty obvious. Like he seems like a beat poet, right? Like it seems like he's the kind of guy who saw, that sort of poetic performance in coffee houses in the 50s and 60s, and was inspired by that. He started earlier though, right? He wasn't always like that.
Because he did like sort of the kooky weatherman kind of thing, and then he I think he kind of he shifted so many times throughout his career. It felt like he had sort of rebirths in different ways, but no, I feel like like maybe in the 70s, and then then there was, I think, another sort of very marked political shift in the 90s, and just kind of getting to like the way he was using language. I think a lot of those lists and stuff kind of came up a little bit later when he started to grow his hair out a little bit more, and things like that, and kind of switched from the more clean cut image, which was what he started with, which a lot of people I think don't know or don't remember, but like even back when he was doing things like the advertising lullaby, right? Like the and that type of thing, which actually that bit, the advertising lullaby, kind of jumping ahead to a poet that I talk about in the book, but Harriet Mullen has a poem called Jingle Jangle that kind of uses like a catalog. It's an abecedarian form, but uses this like a catalog of phrases that are in sort of advertising jingles or or advertisements themselves. And it's playful. There's lots of rhyme and alliteration, but then it kind of exposes something really insidious about the way that advertisers use language in a way that manipulates, but then it kind of goes beyond that and kind of shows how, language can be sort of packaged in a sense in itself to then communicate some really problematic, hurtful, dangerous things. But if it sounds kind of funny, then it can't be that bad, right? So, but there are connections there, and he was, I think, in those sort of lists doing some of that work, kind of calling attention to this language that we kind of accept, but then by putting it all together in this ridiculously long thing that how can anybody memorize, then you start to see it in a different way. You start to see it, right? You start to see it, and then you can start to question it a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like the words popping up in my mind are form and content, right? If we're being academic about it, but it really seems like it's the idea of like, yeah, there's a certain sort of rhythm to an advertising language, right? And if you invoke that, people automatically are sort of like get into that mode, and then you can fuck with it. And like what Carlin does is by making the content slightly different in that form, it calls attention to it, and it ends up being really. I don't know. I like the word you use. The word like disruption, like humor always like breaks something up. You feel that in like professional settings, like in department meetings and stuff like that, right? Like, like humor, like you're all of a sudden when everyone's laughing, it means we're not doing the work, which is kind of interesting.
Which really that's usually when there is the laughter, that's probably the most important thing that's been said in the meeting, right? That's usually what that's what you should be paying attention to, and I think that's something too with humor, is that people see it as like light, right, or frivolous, but not something that is in a way a tool or a technique that can be very it can accommodate complex ideas because of its inherent disruption. And I think that is something that the best political poets who use humor and the best stand-up comics who use humor, they know, and they use that.
That makes sense that like, we're living in an age where like stand-up comedy is highly controversial, right? And like people are talking about what's appropriate to laugh at and what's not. And I mean, I don't even want to get into that conversation really, but to me, it's symptomatic of exactly what you're talking about, which is that there's power to what we laugh at. And it seems like everybody knows that, right? So it's like all of a sudden, like Dave Chappelle is making trans jokes. People are like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like that's really powerful. And to me, that's something that we haven't really come to terms with that in a weird way, like that how much laughter is a sort of a release of something that we're not supposed to talk about, or it's a site where like you said, maybe when the laughter comes at the department meeting, that's the most important thing we should be talking about. It's the thing that made you uncomfortable almost.
It's a rupture. It's a site of rupture. There's something that's bubbling under the surface, and then it comes out, and it comes out sometimes through laughter that can be uncomfortable, but a lot of times it can be generative if you kind of stop and pay attention to it, and it's subversive, right? Laughter and humor can be very subversive, and that's very powerful too. And it also, that makes people uncomfortable as well.
Well, let's talk about poetry. Speaking of making people uncomfortable, because you've chosen four four poets that, I don't know if these are household names, right? I mean,
Probably not.
I'll say Ed Dorn is a household name because
well, in your household,
right? Because Claudia's written a book about him.
Yes.
And I have to say I didn't know who Ed Dorn was before I met Claudia, and she let me know all about that world. But how did you choose the four poets? Because it feels like you could have gone in a lot of different directions.
I could have gone a lot of different directions, and so the way that I wanted to kind of structure the book was to kind of look at the interplay of humor and poetic genre, and how those two factors work together to create political critique. And so I really kind of took a look at four distinct poetic genres. So sort of traditional received forms like the sonnet, then procedural poems. And for the sonnet, I chose to focus mainly on Marilyn Hacker. A procedural, more experimental poetics, and I chose Harriet Mullen for that. The epic poem, and Ed Dorn wrote Gunslinger. And I also talk a little bit about Walcott's of Meros in that chapter too. And then the prose poem. And Russell Edson is considered by many to be like the grandfather of the American prose poem in the late 20th century. So I could have chosen a bunch of different people, but I did debate on whether to focus on Edson or James Tate for the prose poem specifically. But I went with Edson because his work has been so influential on so many prose poets, and I thought that also his humor was very distinctive and maybe different from the other poets that I was looking at in a way. And so I thought that what Harriet Mullen was doing with the procedural poetics was one of the most exciting things that I had seen in a while. So with her book, Sleeping with the Dictionary, it was just, I thought, extremely inventive and playful and fun, but yet also deeply uncomfortable and in different ways. And
what is a procedural poem, for those wondering?
Okay. So
I'll admit I don't know what a procedural poem is. To me, I hear procedural and I'm immediately thinking of like CSI and like detective shows.
Well,
is it not that?
No, but when you said that, it made me think there is sort of maybe sometimes an investigative aspect to reading the procedural poetry. So with procedural poetry, and Mullen is drawing upon experimental poets from sort of African American experimental poetry, but then also French experimental poets, the Oulipo group, who would do sort of wild language experiments, writing a novel that doesn't contain the letter E, or like a sort of exquisite corpse type word games. And then there's one technique that Mullen uses in an interesting way. She sort of flips it a bit, but called sort of N+7 or S+7, depending on who's using it, where you have a text and then you choose certain words from the text, look those words up in the dictionary, goes 7 words down, and then substitute, right? And so Mullen has a number of poems that do that, and that are actually sort of doing that with a prose poetry version of Shakespeare's sonnet. And sometimes it is a more random word, but then sometimes those words and those substitutions are more chosen. So she's making sort of more deliberate choices in order to make the poems more pointed in their criticism, and sort of but still using those sort of procedural
so the
techniques.
Procedure is now I think I know what you're talking about, because I've seen a few poets over the years that do that sort of thing, where they set up a sort of system for themselves, right? And sort of like, let's find the word, but then you intervene a little bit too, right? I guess that it's up to each poet how much they're going to intervene.
It's up to each poet how much they're going to intervene. Mullen intervenes in that book more than, I guess, maybe the ones who were stricter would, but there is it's a constraint, right? It's a creative constraint that's a self-imposed constraint that the poet uses. So the kind of wonderful thing that happens when you have these constraints is that the language kind of explodes beyond the container, right? There are all these wild connections that occur, and in a way, sometimes those constraints can yield something more interesting than a text that has none of those constraints on it. So.
It's like creating like a random number generator or something.
Yeah.
Like it's like creating some sort of machine. It brings up really interesting questions about authorship to me.
Yes.
It's sort of like, where's the hand in the author when you're sort of like, just, I'm going to highlight a bunch of words in the Bible and then, and then throw a 6-sided die and use that number to like create the poem. I mean, to me, that's like you are creating a poem
yes.
It feels almost like, I love your word investigation. It's almost like discovery or excavation or finding. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's finding. And then there's an element of playfulness about that too, like a game-like quality, right? And there are in that book word games are sort of all over the place. So beyond just punning, like acrostics, different word games that have been used in different scenarios, but also in poetry, that have a history there too. So yeah, there is a sense of playfulness, but Mullen does make more interventions in the work in order to really put forth more pointed, directed messages than some of the other experimental procedural poets who adhere to those other rules very, very strictly and don't make those interventions as much. But I also think, like you're saying, it brings in the question of like authorship, but also just the questions of craft. I think a lot of times with the procedural poetics, there is something very much related to the visual art world and, collage and different forms of art that way as well, or, other forms of visual art that might have constraints, whether because of materials or different things. And so I think that there are connections there too.
What do we do? What do we do with Ed Dorn and his? You say epic poem, but I mean, there's also this idea of, and then maybe this is separate from the epic idea, and maybe separate from Dorn, but it's something that popped out to me reading your book, is this idea of lyric and that like poetry is lyric to people, and I had to look that up because I was thinking like, what do you mean by lyric? Because when I hear, again, it's another one of those terms I hear, okay, that's a song, something meant to be sung. Is that what you mean by that? Because can you explain a little bit of that? Because that seems like a trap of like the way people think about poetry. And
so I think with the lyric, although it does come from the word the lyre, to be sung, there is a sort of a sense of the lyric poem. Virginia Jackson is a critic who writes about lyricism and how somehow the lyric became associated with all poetry writ large, and kind of covering over the different varieties of genres of poetry that exist. And so with a lyric, a lot of times more sort of contemplative, sort of self-contained, that type of form would feel a little more insular, and with the different genres, with talking about the procedural, the lyric I, right, or the speaker, it's not there in the same sort of way, right?
Okay, yeah.
Well, actually, in Dorn's epic, there's a character named I who was shot and dies, which is hilarious. But it is a wild.
I know. Every time
book.
I jump into Dorn, I'm like, good Lord. I mean, the poetry books that are in the section of the bookshelf that's in Claudia's office are like, it's like Charles Olson stuff. I find it very challenging material, honestly.
It's very challenging, and doesn't fit into sort of the mold of what a lot of people think of as poetry. But Dorn's work is highly elusive. I mean, though it's epic. It's an epic poetry. It draws on the epic traditions. There are plays on Homeric epithets that are extremely funny. There's a character of that's a horse and has numerous epithets, including the bombed out horse or drug references. Each section of the poem is sort of dedicated to a different drug. I mean, it's wild, it's hilarious, but there are so many different genres within it that it contains and that it brings in. Like the Western is all over the place, and so it's even there are lots of sort of moments that feel very influenced by film, and so
yeah, that's right.
It's very inclusive, but because of that, it's very challenging. It keeps you on your toes, and you have to be willing to switch gears or to hold things that don't seem like they should go together and to make those connections. Yeah, because I mean, there's also a lot of very, I would say, intense sort of scientific allusions, like physics, and like, so there are just so many different concepts that you can see on one page of that text that can really challenge a reader to hold all those different concepts in their mind.
Well, with Dorn, it feels like, I mean, it's really clear with him that there's an engagement with this mythic America, right? And
yes.
So, in the same way that Ginsberg is like singing America or something. But it seems like all four of your poets are united by a kind of intervention on American society, right? In that post-war period, like that's partly why you chose them, right?
Yes.
Is that there's sort of like there's something political going on with all of them, right? Like what is it that we could say that they're all doing? I guess. Are they? I know they're not part of a unified project, but
no,
your book is kind of uniting them a little bit, right?
My book is kind of uniting them for sure. But I mean, I think they're all looking at certain failures of American society in certain ways, or limitations of American society and who it accepts and who it marginalizes, I think, in a number of ways. So the counterculture that's represented in Dorn, that's sort of pretty obvious there. And also you have like kind of this lone outsider figure who is, is going on a mission to fight to duel this Howard Hughes figure. So he's kind of on a mission to go try to kill capitalism, really.
Yeah, right.
The book kills me. It's so funny. And Mullen also in her procedural poems skewers capitalism in a number of ways, and also shows relationships between the way that capitalism enables other forms of subjugation like racism, sexism. So with Hacker, it is her work is it's a book like sonnet sequence, and it's a love story between two women, and it's playing on a lot of the tropes of traditional sonnet sequences that were usually either written by a man to like this imagined idealized woman, or to a younger female lover, and it really playfully engages that genre. But there's a lot of political critique going on there too. Again, this is before gay marriage was legalized, and
Marilyn Hacker, for those that don't know, I mean, the connection that I had was with Samuel Delany. Like they were married between 1961 and 1980, and I think of them both as sort of like queer poetic figures, right? And we don't we haven't read any poetry yet, so maybe we'll just read this line that you excerpted from Marilyn Hacker, which I thought kind of illustrates a little of what you're talking about, from a poem where she says, and these are the 4 lines, and I don't know, she says, that's the authorship question. All right, here's the line. You, little one, are just the kind of boy I would have eyeballed at the bar and cruised efficiently and taken home and used. Hell no. The bodice busters say enjoy. I'm thinking of KJ Shepherd with that one. He has lots of poems about cruising, but there's something really intense about that.
Yeah, I think it's bringing up a lot of different tropes in a very short space, and also like this idea of the bodice buster with the romance and
the bodice buster.
I know it's such a great term. But yeah, I think kind of rejecting certain received notions of romance and love, and trying to sort of recast a love story in a romance in a way that feels more appropriate, feels more real. But then also with those explorations of love, kind of showing how that love is not accepted or recognized in society the same way as like a heterosexual couple's love would be. So there's other poems in there that talks about, that heterosexual couples get to put their names on buildings and have their love sort of reified in that sort of way, and codified in that sort of way where they are seen as sort of on the margins, and their love is not seen in that way. It's not afforded that level of respect or recognition. And again, but it does so in a way that's very, very playful. And in that poem where it's criticizing not being able to put their names on a building, it doesn't go into sort of a diatribe against that idea, but the speaker of the poem says to the lover to kiss her. And that is sort of the response. It's like, we will enjoy back to that word, enjoy, which he quoted, we will enjoy our romance, we will enjoy our experience, and that is sort of the best response and the best, in a way, revenge, to these this society that doesn't see us as legitimate in some way, shape, or form, and so it's a very hedonistic response to those multiple messages and being sort of pushed away or shoved aside or declared less than. So it's a celebratory response as well as being a very political response.
Yeah, and thinking about the line to stand-up comedy now, stand-up comedy feels so much more direct, right? It feels like with poetry, there's maybe an impulse that you've located here that I think is right. That there's like an impulse that's close to what we call humor, in both places, but they're accomplished in different ways, right? Like I feel like the stand-up comedy does rely on a punchline and a quote unquote joke, whereas when I'm looking at these lines of poetry that you quoted, I'm kind of like, where is the joke is working in a different way? Does that make sense? It's like it's somehow functioning. It's still a joke, but it's not quite a joke in the way I've been trained to think it is.
Yeah, I mean, because it's a different structure a lot of times. So sometimes you see
it's not knock knock, who's there?
Yeah. It's but there are sometimes those tight little moments, but a lot of times, the humor is created in different ways. And I think what I'm seeing across the poets that I talk about here is the way that the humor is interacting with the conventions of the poetic genre. That actually is really interesting. So with Hacker, since we're kind of talking about her, kind of with this lesbian relationship, making really jokey references to the bloodstained sheets that newly married heterosexual couple would display, like sort of back in the ages, but really they spilled red wine on the sheet. And so just playing with those sort of genre expectations that would have been like in those old sonnets, and then that the humor is kind of created there. And so with Dorn and the epic, I mean, all the epithets that the Homeric epithets like the rosy fingered dawn, like these kind of, gorgeous refrains that become ridiculous, with the horse being referred to as an odd-toed unglegate. Just kind of just bananas language play, but it's this expectation, like the rug is kind of pulled out from under you because you're set up to have these expectations because of the genre, but then their interactions and interventions with the genre and sort of flipping the genre on its head create these moments of humor. But then a lot of times those interventions and by, I guess, flouting those expectations, that's also a moment where things can be questioned, right? It's sort of like the nature of like, well, what types of relationships get to be displayed in a sonnet sequence and that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, your whole book made me think about the question of like, what does a poem do? Like what work does it perform, etc. But it also made me think about like performance because I mean, I'm one of these guys that does think about Ginsberg obviously a lot. And
I do too.
Yeah, but that might be just because he's one of the most famous poets of that era. I'm actually looking at it. There's a picture of him on my wall. Nice. Alan's looking at us over there, but yeah, I mean, I feel like he wrote a lot of stuff to be performed, right? Like it was like, I'm gonna go say this in front of people. I'm gonna say it a certain way, and there's actually, it feels like you would write it a different way. Does that make sense? That like if you're gonna, and like your poets aren't necessarily performers, or are they?
No, I would say that some of them are very, very good readers, but I wouldn't say necessarily performance first.
Yeah. The poems are the poems that you read. They're meant to be read alone, right?
Poems on the page. Although I do think that there is always something to be gained from hearing poetry read aloud. But and I think you start to hear textures and rhythms that that you don't necessarily always hear.
We need it. We would have a better society if we had if poetry readings were more woven into our culture.
I know.
I'll die on that hill.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. Or people just reading to each other. I just think there's something beautiful about that. But definitely more poetry readings. But yeah, I mean, this poetry that's in the book is all very much conceived of and thought of on the page, right? So that's sort of the space where it is first, I would say. There is some poetry that exists in a space where it is performance first, right? And so spoken word poetry. But like you're saying with Ginsberg, some of his work maybe feels like it is in its purest form when it is performed, right?
And, I had the luck to be able to go see Amiri Baraka do a couple readings over the years before he died, because Claudia wrote about him too. For those that don't know, the relationship between Amiri Baraka and Ed Doran was kind of a profound friendship, and they wrote a lot to each other. And those letters are what Claudia based her book on. But we got to go see Amiri Baraka a couple times, and every time he was doing these things called lokus, where he called them, it was like a play on haiku as the loku, and he was just reading these 2 or 3 line little bits that were, I was sitting there, everyone's rolling in the audience. Yeah. They were meant to be, I was like, this guy's a stand-up comic. Like, yes. He was entirely trying to make us laugh. He said, one of the ones I remember is someone set up a meeting between Oprah Winfrey and Tyler Perry at a restaurant in Harlem. I'll kill them both. That's what he said. And all of us were like, holy shit. Like, I didn't know how to take any of this, but it was hilarious. And really, talk about disruption, was like, what the fuck? I can't believe he said that. But it was clearly like written for an audience.
Yes.
To hear and laugh at. And that's, to me, like, when I hear stand-up comedy like coming out, like I love your book kind of identifying this moment where, Carlin and Pryor and all these like social critic type stand-up comics, because they seem like they are kind of like inspired by a historical moment of writing that's like kind of doing this thing where you're like, I see Ginsberg and George Carlin in a way.
Yes, absolutely. I see that connection for sure. But yeah, I think Yeah, there's definitely poetry that is written to be performed, or it feels like it is in its highest form when it is performed. And then there's poetry that feels like its main home is on the page, right? And a lot of the poetry that is in the book is the latter, for sure. But yeah, those lokus sound absolutely amazing. Oh my goodness! And but
so
just also
good.
that form feels like that punchy.
Oh yeah, and you know what's cool is he would like snap his fingers and sing. Well, he would go, dude. He would go ba ba ba, and then say it, and it was like, God damn, he's just setting us up for these. I want to talk with you maybe about your own poetry, Carrie, and like how you approach this stuff, because your poetry, I love it. And it to me like brings out a lot of stuff about class and the lived experience of class, and there's a lot of humor in there too, but you have a very direct sort of you're not a procedural poet, right?
No,
you're not finding words in the phone book to put together.
No, I'm not a procedural poet. I'm very much, I think, a narrative poet, but I write a lot of prose poetry, so I adore Russell Edson, and think that he is definitely an influence of my work. I discovered him, was introduced to his work when I was a college freshman, and I'm very grateful for that. And he's very weird and absurd, and not all my work is weird and absurd, but there's elements of that in there for sure. But I feel like that was a freeing experience when I was introduced to his work, and just
can I read a line from Russell Edson?
Oh yeah,
that you quoted, the one that stuck out to me from the book that I thought was hilarious. I think, therefore I am, said a man whose mother quickly hit him on the head, saying, I hit my son on his head, therefore I am. No, you've got it all wrong, cried the man. So she hit him on the head again and cried, therefore I am. I can't even read it without laughing.
It's so funny. Like, oh my God. When I read the first book I read of Edson's was The Tormented Mirror, which is one of his later books. But it had just come out, and I think I had a poetry professor, Jan Beatty, who introduced me to his work. And so we read that, but then I just went to the library and just read everything, just absolutely everything. Because yeah, just so funny and so absurd, and just turning things on their heads in ways that felt fresh and surprising, even though it feels like a lot of his work has kind of the same tone, and it kind of feels like it might be doing similar things. There was always something surprising in one of his books, but yeah, that's just, there's a lot of violence in his world.
I don't know if you would make this connection. There's another one of those like big authors of that era that pops up when I was reading your book was Vonnegut. Like Vonnegut's style seems like it links up with that impulse, and there's lots of violence there too.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, it's Edson's world is sort of like a nightmare, like book of fables. Like, it's just this weird kind of childlike sometimes introduction of the way, like, there was a man, but then it just turns sideways and gets really strange and dark and often violent, but also hilarious, and it's very pointed in its criticism of society, of sort of his society, without actually feeling super connected to the society. It's like he creates his own world, but that weird nightmare fable world is directly interrogating the reality, the lived society. But I was just such a fan of his work, but I also love, and I grew up around a lot of storytellers, and so I love narrative. I love telling stories, but I find that that the prose poem is a great vehicle for telling stories in a I don't know, a kind of intense way. Yeah. And that's something that I've been drawn to it as well, is kind of trying to capture and distill a story in a way that puts pressure on it.
That's a great way of putting it. I was just reading your poem "Namesake." That's about well, maybe can I read it, Carrie?
Sure.
Can I read "Namesake"? Let's see. I know I have it here, and this will give people an idea of what you're doing. So this is called "Namesake" from Carrie Conners. When my fiancé asked why I wasn't changing my name after our wedding, I told him how my grandmother met my grandfather when she was 17. He's stationed in Alabama, a drill sergeant, overseeing 3 of his men as they dug a 6 by 6 by 6 foot hole in the red clay, a receptacle for the gum they were chewing while marching, before filling it up again. He whistled as she walked down the street carrying bread home from the Piggly Wiggly. When he asked her name, Ruby Pauline must have seemed out of line. After they married, she took a train north to West Virginia, where he got a job working in the steel mills. She coughed at the air thick with coal dust from the mines and scrubbed soot out of the house every day. One night, when the smell of cheap whiskey greeted her at the door, he started calling her Pat. She never asked why he changed her name, but she learned to respond, though she took to wearing red scarves, sundresses, growing rose bushes, tall as a man, with jewel red buds. Maybe he thought the name Ruby was too flashy, that it would attract too much attention from men in town. Maybe Pat was an old lover that married a richer man, or after being scolded like a mangy dog by bosses in the mill, he could have longed for his drill sergeant days, when people answered to him no matter what he called them, and became anyone he told them to be. Devastating stuff, Carrie. Really, so good.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I love that idea of you sort of like distilling, and kind of, because I'm the kind of guy who's like, I'm going to write a 1,500-page memoir. Like, there's like this Nosgard book behind me, a guy that writes like, thousands of pages every day. Yeah. But I like your idea of like, it seems like a challenge, sort of like, can I take this feeling, this moment, and try to tell a story in like a few lines that really just stabs you? Because honestly, a lot of your poems are like that. There's a kind of a punchline to your poem there, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's there's a turn. So I don't write in received forms. I don't write sonnets. I write in free verse. But yeah, I definitely feel like I have a lot of poems that have that turn, that have that sort of turn at the end and have a punchline. And that one isn't really funny.
I picked a really super funny poem. Yeah.
But I do have a lot of poems that are like very jokey and funny, but also I'm really interested in the way that people talk, and I find that endlessly amusing, and so I use a lot of overheard speech in that way too, and that kind of lends itself to some jokey moments. But yeah, I write a lot too about my background from being from West Virginia, issues of class, issues of power, issues of work and labor, and
well, when I think of West Virginia, I think of coal mines, right? But is it steel mills that your family's more directly connected to?
Yeah, steel with my family, yeah. But in the 80s, when I was very, very young, and that's when all of the steel mills started to shut down. And so that's sort of something that was very present in my childhood was the struggle of that deindustrialization that was happening.
You're in Joe Manchin territory, right? Oh my God. Yeah.
Boo.
I mean, that's a whole other conversation, honestly. But like you and I, for those that don't know, Carrie and I and Claudia and Fred and all of us have been friends for a long time, and you and I have spoken quite a bit about your background and everything. But I wonder, like, when you come from West Virginia and you come from a sort of working class sort of environment, I'm just curious, because I don't know if I've heard this story. Like, how do you find poetry? How did you find that direction? Because you're around storytellers, you're around certain kinds of storytellers, and like this sort of particular culture. But then there's this like academic poetry, Carrie, that comes out at some point, and like, where does that come from?
I don't know. No, I'm a big nerd. I always have been. But it was when I was a kid, like a young kid. So where I grew up in the town, Moundsville, West Virginia, I grew up across the street. It's shut down now. It closed in '95, but it's still there. Was the state penitentiary, like right across the street. And
Jesus.
then on the way to school, which was only a couple blocks away, elementary school, there is the largest conical Indian burial mound east of the Mississippi River. The Adena Indians, like a very ancient culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it's intense as fuck. Jesus, yeah.
But as a poet, as a gift, but we were given like an assignment in the second grade or whatever to write a poem about the mound, and most of the students are like, the mound actually does have steps, 55 steps, one for each county of the state of West Virginia, that you can walk up to the top of it. Like it's a large structure, but which is, we can talk about the ethics of it. But most students are like, the mound has steps that go round and round. Boom, done. And I wrote this like really long, really sad poem about the people who were buried there, and the fact that the culture was wiped out, and it was just, but there was something that was unlocked, I think, in that writing exercise, and I just sort of got into reading lots of poetry after that, and just kept writing. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to take like a little community class with someone who is now the poet laureate of West Virginia, Mark Harshman, when I was young. So he was my first poetry teacher. It was like me and a lot of like these older women. I was like the little 8-9-year-old me. But then I was just a bookworm in the library, and I just checked out everything and read everything. So the poetry bug kind of bit me, and then I read other poets from my region, and then was really fell in love with poetry in college when I took my first workshop there. But I've always been a big reader, and I've always sort of had poetry in my life. And then, like I said, I just think with the storytellers in my life as well, that was a huge influence. I had a lot of good talkers around me, very funny people in my family and in my life, and I listened a lot, and just sort of absorbed a lot of the speech rhythms and storytelling rhythms, and that kind of made its way into my work.
And the stand-up comedy thing, it seems like it's there too, right? Like at some point you're a fan of stand-up comedy, right?
Oh yeah, that's like my family. And we would always watch stand-up. I have an older brother, and I would probably think that we were too young to watch. But I mean, early memories that I have of watching, like Carlin, Pryor, Eddie Murphy, like just, we would watch those comic relief specials on HBO, like back in the day. It was like,
were you allowed to watch that stuff? Because I wasn't allowed. I had to go to neighbors' houses to see that stuff. And like the first time I was seeing like the Eddie Murphy, I mean, those are the first times I heard those words. I feel like you probably heard those words.
Yes. And so colorful language. Also, my father was a president of his local union for steelworkers union, and but that coarse language is just language, right? And it's also, I think. I was telling somebody the other day, like, because somebody apologized for swearing. I was like, I think swearing is like my love language. Like that's just like where it feels like home.
I know that rich people swear, obviously.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's a class thing about language that you're writing about in your book, and you're sort of touching on too, which is a type of humor and a type of language and a type of joking that is more kind of common among the working class. And I think in part, like my parents being like, don't curse, it wasn't coming from religion necessarily. My parents aren't
No.
really religious people. It was more like be respectable, you know.
Respectability, right? There's a sense of respectability, but also like I think if you know, there's something maybe to that is a reverence if you do use that language and kind of well, who are we supposed to be respecting? And so if you don't respect certain people who have power over you, then you know, you call them a dirty word. And so
well, that's very that's very 60s too, right? Like throwing up the middle finger and like it just felt like there was. You said something. You say something in your book that I thought was really sharp too. That I wanted to make sure we say on this program, which is the idea that like I don't know what's subversive in a certain like historical context isn't subversive in other historical contexts. I don't know. That made a lot of sense to me. That like you could write a poem that's like, whoa, that's a real revolutionary thing to say in 1968. That's not necessarily going to work or pop in the same way in 2022, right?
Yeah. And I think that you know, things that felt shocking or subversive, you know, at certain times that you know, right, they wouldn't register in the same way. They wouldn't have the same kind of impact. And so I think that, you know, although there are some things that maybe transcend history, like, you know, a pratfall is probably always going to be funny, but there are some moments, some instances of things that are funny or shocking or subversive that just become kind of enveloped and accepted into the society that aren't shocking anymore. And you know, language is evident of that because like I think, you know, there are certain words that were maybe you couldn't really say or they wouldn't have that a huge impact now that like, you know, even 30 years ago would have felt.
But it's the other way too, right? Like with like I know that like my students don't like the R word, right? Like they don't want to hear that. Like that's just like that, and that actually shocked me because I grew up saying that word, and I grew up like, and I'm like now the old guy that's like, whoa, the generations have moved past me. What am I supposed to do? But it's really interesting to me that language goes both ways. That you know,
it does,
sense. Right?
And then sometimes slurs are sort of then readopted or sort of, you know, co-opted, you know, by certain groups as well. And so, you know, it is really interesting how that happens. And there are shifts, absolutely. But it's, and so that's why, you know, and some things that maybe were completely accepted, then if we read them now, we're like, holy, you know, shit, like, what are you supposed to, right. How could you say that? But, it's so, you know, and we always have to contextualize things for students in class, right? If you read something, you know,
from another time. I mean, I teach history, so like everything we read is filled with cancelable material, you know, like just awful stuff. And I mean, I've gotten to the point where I'm like, I don't really want to read this out loud in front of people. You read it out loud, you know, or make the students read it on their own and just let them know because, it's part of what we're talking about with stand-up comedy. You know, people taking it very, very seriously to me indicates how humor is hitting on something. Really, I mean, we use the word like that joke like hit a nerve, but it seems like that's real.
No, it is real. It is real, and I think that you know, it's reflective of the cultural moment. You know, and I think that's what we're seeing. But I also think that you know, there's been a lot of evolution, I think, in the last decade or so, but I think especially the last like 5 or so years, like in what stand-up can look like. And I think that's a really interesting thing that's kind of happening too, that there are tonal shifts that are like, there's some different stuff that's going on. Not that stand-ups haven't been doing those types of experimental things for a while, but it just feels like it's more present, of having more moments of sort of sober reflection in a stand-up set, right? Although, like, you know, there were some entire sets of Carlin that didn't necessarily always feel like stand-up, that kind of felt like just
lectures.
Lectures, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's part of what happened with comedy. It seems like they became like, where are the jokes here? Like all I'm hearing now, like, and it's so rare actually. It's with stand up comedy. It's an interesting form because it's like it's really popular. Like there's tons of like Netflix.
Oh yeah.
Where is there any other forum where there's like one person with a microphone just sort of like saying what they think? Like there's not a lot of that. There aren't a lot of like, there's not like Netflix poetry readings, right?
Yeah.
Like there might be like a slam documentary.
There might be a slam documentary, or like there's that cringe, but that's also kind of a genre of storytelling, and there's humor there too. So that's kind of, those are all, they're connections between those. But yeah, with we're not seeing necessarily like the any sort of poetry reading on Netflix taking off in popularity, like some of the stand-up specials that are like so hotly anticipated,
Well, I mean, it's different forms in a lot of ways, and I appreciate your book so much because it sort of contemplates the lines between those forms and sort of like what exactly is it? Because I think that, I don't know, with stand-up comedy, it's sort of it's meant to be like a broad sense of humor, right? It's like aiming at like, this is going to make everyone laugh. Where with poetry, it seems like there's a different register that's being hit oftentimes. I don't mean that like, obviously poems also have fart jokes in them and like that, right? But there's also like in a lot of the poems that you're locating, the humor isn't so set up punchline. It's more coming out of these collisions of form and content
and generic expectation, right? So like and so I think the audience for that poetry and for that humor, for those jokes to land, those are people who are familiar with those genres, right? They have those expectations because they have read within that space, right? And so that's what allows kind of the humor to land, is that knowledge, right? That they are well versed in that space. And kind of thinking back to Mullen and the procedural poems, some of the humor comes also from the fact that some of her N+7 or S+7 poems are sort of these, rewritings of a Shakespearean sonnet, which, many readers of poetry would be very, very familiar with. And so then hearing the changes to that sonnet against their knowledge of the original sonnet is what creates that moment of disruption and the moments of humor.
I love that. It's kind of like the worst stand-up comics are the ones that like kind of pander to the audience and sort of like hit the things that they already, it's the generic expectation, I guess. But I feel like the ones that are doing disruption, and the poets too, are like almost like creating a public or creating the audience, like saying like, no, you're gonna, I'm not just gonna like locate what you think is funny already. I'm gonna actually train you how to see this as funny. Yeah.
And also sort of inviting with the poets here, and I think especially with I can say with all of them, I was going to limit it to the procedural poets, but I don't think so. I think I could see this with Hacker and Dorn and Edson too, that it is giving a lot of respect to the reader to do that work. It's respecting the audience, so not pandering at all. If anything, challenging them, kind of pushing them, and sometimes in some cases almost aggressively. I would say with Dorn, he could be a little aggressive with his reader and wanting people to push themselves to look closer, to question more. And there's almost a confrontational aspect to it.
Whereas so much stand-up comedy or other poem kind of poetic approaches would be like more about like kind of welcoming and comforting. Dorn
and
stuff,
making the connection,
Dorn stuff was like, this guy wants to kick my ass.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like, and some of the, the really highly elusive quality is almost like, you better go learn this. It has that kind of tone about it, which, it's a little confrontational and challenging, but I think that works with a lot of the ideas that he was working with, and also just like the creating the work that was so countercultural. I think that positioning makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's if you're going to be challenging status quo, you need to challenge in a way to make that point, to make your points to get across, and to also just have a bite to things, right? And so, and his work definitely has a bite.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And it has, I mean, all of these poets actually, I think, are, I don't know, it's kind of like the form and content games are in part calling attention to the structure of things, right? Like, it's not just like,
yes,
this Donald Trump sucks, and that's what my poem is about, right?
No, it's like, Mullen.
It's like, let's think deeply about what the fuck we're all up to here, and even what we are as humans, etc. Yeah,
what we are as humans, but then also, like, looking at as the structure of a poem, and sometimes seeing a constraint or things like that. With Mullen, a lot of times the structure can recall, societal structures that are limiting. Like, certain things invoke ideas about structural racism, right? And how things are baked in to the system, right? And it's not just about one individual and another individual, but that it is a structural issue. And that's, I think, something that poetic form, poetic genre, can allow, is a, kind of mimicking of certain structures for then the poets to call attention to, right? And so it can kind of stand in or recall those structures and kind of get at something that isn't just, on this individual personal level.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was going to say your poem that I just read, Namesake, is, it starts with a very personal question, it's kind of like, well, why are you going to change your name when we get married? And you think like, oh, we'll have a very personal answer, and it is a personal answer, but it gets at something much, much bigger, like I'm thinking about a lot when at the end of that poem, and not just like your personal decision about your name. I'm now like thinking about the U.S. military. I'm thinking about patriarchy. I'm thinking about alcoholism. I'm thinking about so many, clothing and like the red scarves and all of these things coming together in my head in a very, I don't know, a way that those items hadn't mixed in my head before. And so, yeah, it does call attention to structure in a really important way. Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. And praise your poem, but I think it's really cool. Yeah.
No, that's awesome. No, if I'm turning like 13 Shades of Red, but no, I do think that that is something that poetry can do in myriad ways because of the genre, right? It allows creates special opportunities for those kinds of critiques, and for those kinds of critiques to be expressed in really succinct, pointed, yet complex ways.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I agree. It makes me disappointed in Twitter because Twitter has a constraint on it, right? You should see a lot more poetry there. Like, I feel like I see the same shit over and over, written in the same like generic style.
I know, but
maybe there's a poetry Twitter. There's poets on Twitter that I'm not.
Oh, there's poetry
following.
Poetry Twitter is lit. It is lit. It is. It's a good time. But
by lit you mean literary.
Yeah. But I mean, it is. Yeah. But it is. Can be really playful. It can be really playful. It can be really fun. But I agree that like
it seems a natural place for it.
It seems natural. It is, and I think that some people use it really well, and I think that I understand though the repetition, right? Like the same kinds of jokes or structures that kind of get played out, but then I think that kind of is in itself a constraint that people sort of intervene with and twist a little bit. And so
memes.
I actually, memes. And then there's like a zillion takes on the William Carlos Williams poem about the plums, right?
That's right. Yeah. I think I've probably participated in that myself.
Oh yeah, me too. And it's fun, but then occasionally you will hit upon one that is like really, really fantastic. And so, sometimes those things can feel played out, but yet sometimes those constraints can yield something pretty special. There's some accounts that do some really fun things with like the limerick form, which are good too. And I think have been some of my my favorites that are also very political, using that sort of jokey form in a way to skewer political figures and kind of discuss the news stories in a way that is really clever too. So I think there's some bright spots of poetry on Twitter, but
right.
I agree it could be better.
I always wonder about how many people that are doing that William Carlos Williams poem like know the original poem, because it's such a great poem. Like the original
so good.
is like just one of the greatest, and
I love it.
Every time I see the joke, like a joke riff on it, I always think of them like just the Cold Plums and the like original poem, because it's like it's and so much of that, so much of the things.
So much depends.
Yeah, right.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say, Carrie, is like so much of what you write about in your book is evident in your poetry, right? Like it seems like, even though you're not doing procedural poems or exactly writing like any of these writers, what you've done, I think, is I think internalized a lot of these ideas, and you're highly skilled at condensing and distilling these stories. I want to say the names of your books really quickly again before we say goodbye. Your books of poetry are called Luscious Struggle, and the latest one is Species of Least Concern. And the book we spent most of our time talking about today was Laugh Lines: Humor, Genre, and Political Critique in Late 20th Century American Poetry. I feel very official now. Carrie Conners, thank you so much for joining me. This is really fun.
Thank you so much for having me, David. This was a blast. It was a joy to get to speak to you, see you. It's been too long.
Well, okay. I think that's going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to give a huge thank you to Carrie Conners for coming on the show. Always great to speak with Carrie, whether we are talking into microphones or not. I want to say the name of her book again. Check out Laugh Lines: Humor, Genre, and Political Critique in Late 20th Century American Poetry. And Carrie's poetry itself is just really great stuff too, and I'm glad I was able to read a few excerpts. There's a lot more in her book, so check all of that stuff out, and check out our Patreon for more Nostalgia Trap stuff this summer. Patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap, with bonus podcasts called Gender Trap and Campus Trap, with people like Yasmin Nair and Ryan Boyd. I am really excited to get into that stuff, and you can access all of it for one subscription. Patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. We will talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.